Welcome, true crime aficionados, to a story that will chill you to the bone and challenge everything you thought you knew about the darkness that can reside in the human mind. The case we're about to delve into is a labyrinth of horror, a series of killings so meticulously planned and flawlessly executed that they could only be the work of a murderer with the IQ of a devil. This gruesome chain of shocking killings didn't just cross the line. It shattered all boundaries, leaving a city in the grip of fear and a team of seasoned detectives questioning their own sanity. The evidence was there, but it was a puzzle crafted by a grandmaster, each piece a taunt, each victim a pawn in a twisted game. Before we descend into this abyss of calculated evil, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single detail of this mind-bending investigation. Now, brace yourselves as we uncover the story of a killer who turned murder into a horrifying art form. The first Tuesday of October dawned crisp and clear over the sprawling metropolis of Viridia, a city that prided itself on its clean streets and low crime rates. The illusion of tranquility, however, was about to be irrevocably shattered. In a quiet, upscale neighborhood, nestled amongst manicured lawns and stately homes, a scene of unimaginable horror was waiting to be discovered. The residence belonged to renowned psychiatrist, Dr. Alistair Finch, a man known for his brilliant mind and his work with some of the city's most disturbed individuals. But on this particular morning, it was the inside of his own mind, or rather the lack of it, that would become the subject of a gruesome investigation. The call came in at 8:47 a.m. from Dr. Finch's housekeeper, a frantic, almost incoherent woman who had stumbled upon a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her days. Detective Miles Corbin and his partner, Detective Evelyn Reed, were the first on the scene. Corbin, a man whose weary eyes had seen more than their fair share of human depravity, felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach as he crossed the yellow tape. The house, a modern architectural marvel of glass and steel, stood in stark contrast to the archaic brutality that lay within. The living room was a macabre masterpiece of carnage. Dr. Finch was positioned in the center of the room, seated in a high-backed leather armchair, his head slumped to one side. His eyes, once filled with intellectual curiosity, were now vacant, staring at a point beyond the realm of the living. But it wasn't the stillness of death that sent a chill down Corbin's spine. It was the meticulous, almost artistic arrangement of the scene. The walls, once a pristine white, were now adorned with a chaotic yet strangely deliberate pattern of blood splatters, resembling a grotesque, abstract painting. On the floor, a complex geometric pattern had been drawn in what appeared to be a mixture of salt and ash, encircling the victim. And on a small, ornate table beside the chair, a single black feather rested atop a worn copy of Dante's Inferno. Reed, a detective whose sharp intellect was often masked by her calm demeanor, began a methodical scan of the room, her eyes missing no detail. "No signs of forced entry," she stated, her voice steady despite the horrific scene. "The security system was disarmed from the inside. Whoever did this was either let in or they knew the codes." Corbin knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the intricate pattern on the floor. "Cause of death isn't immediately obvious," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the victim. "No gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no signs of a struggle." He gently tilted Dr. Finch's head, revealing a small, almost imperceptible puncture mark at the base of his skull. Whatever they used, it was precise, professional. As the forensics team swarmed the scene, their hushed tones a stark contrast to the silent screams that seemed to echo in the room, Corbin and Reed began to piece together the first fragments of an impossible puzzle. The killer was intelligent, meticulous, and patient. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, a statement. But what was the message and who was the intended audience? The initial investigation into Dr. Finch's life revealed a man with a complex and, at times, controversial career. He specialized in criminal psychology, often consulting with the police on high-profile cases. His patient files were a veritable who's who of the city's criminal underworld, from petty thieves to convicted murderers. The list of potential suspects was a daunting one. Had one of his former patients sought revenge? Or was this connected to a case he had helped solve? Days turned into a week, and the investigation seemed to be hitting a dead end. The autopsy report confirmed Corbin's initial suspicion. Dr. Finch had been killed by a lethal injection of a rare, fast-acting neurotoxin, a substance so potent that a single drop would be fatal. The precision of the injection directly into the brainstem suggested a killer with medical knowledge, or at the very least, extensive research. The black feather was analyzed and found to be from a raven, a bird often associated with death and dark omens in mythology. The geometric pattern on the floor was identified as a sigil, a symbol used in ritual magic, but its specific meaning remained elusive. The media had a field day with the story, dubbing the killer the artisan for the macabre artistry of the crime scene. Public fear began to mount, and pressure on the police department to make an arrest intensified. Corbin and Reed found themselves working around the clock, fueled by caffeine and a shared determination to catch the phantom who had so brazenly violated their city's peace. They delved into Dr. Finch's patient files, a labyrinth of disturbed minds and dark secrets. They interviewed his colleagues, his friends, and his estranged family, but each lead seemed to dissolve into a frustrating dead end. The artisan had covered their tracks with an almost supernatural level of care. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. It was as if a ghost had slipped into Dr. Finch's home, committed an unspeakable act, and then vanished into thin air. Just as a sense of despair began to set in, a second body was found. The victim was a prominent art critic, a man known for his scathing reviews and his ability to make or break an artist's career. The scene of the crime was a chilling echo of the first, yet with its own unique and twisted signature. The victim was found in his gallery, posed like a classical statue, his body contorted into an unnaturally graceful position. The walls were once again adorned with a gruesome tapestry of blood, but this time, the pattern was different, more fluid and expressive. And on a pedestal beside the body, a single white feather lay next to a copy of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. The city was now in the grip of a full-blown panic. The artisan was not a one-time killer. They were a serial murderer, and their canvas was the city itself. Corbin and Reed were back at square one, but now they had a second crime scene to dissect, a second set of clues to decipher. The two murders were clearly connected, the work of the same deranged, yet brilliant mind. The feathers, the books, the artistic staging of the bodies, it was all part of a larger, more terrifying narrative. The detectives found themselves in a race against time, not only to catch a killer but to understand the twisted logic that drove them. They were no longer just investigating a murder. They were trying to solve a riddle written in blood and framed in fear. They were dealing with a murderer who saw themselves as an artist, a philosopher, a puppeteer pulling the strings of life and death. They were dealing with a murderer with the IQ of a devil, and the game had only just begun. The gruesome chain of shocking killings had not only shattered the city's sense of security, it had shattered all boundaries of what they thought was possible, plunging them into a darkness from which there seemed to be no escape. The first chapter of Viridia's nightmare had been written, and the chilling promise of more to come hung heavy in the air. The city held its breath, waiting for the artisan's next masterpiece. The discovery of the second victim sent shockwaves through the already terrified city of Viridia. The media frenzy reached a fever pitch, with headlines screaming about the artisan of death and the poetic killer. The public's fear was palpable, a tangible entity that seemed to hang in the autumn air, thick and suffocating. For detectives Corbin and Reed, the second murder was a double-edged sword. It confirmed their worst fears. They were dealing with a serial killer, but it also provided them with a new set of clues, a second verse in the artisan's twisted symphony of death. The art critic, Julian Croft, was a man who had made a living from deconstructing the work of others, and now, his own body had been deconstructed and reassembled into a grotesque work of art. The cause of death was the same as Dr. Finch's, a precise injection of a rare neurotoxin. The white feather, identified as being from a dove, and the copy of The Picture of Dorian Gray were the killer's new calling cards. Corbin and Reed knew that these seemingly random objects were anything but. They were clues, breadcrumbs left by a meticulous and taunting killer. The detectives found themselves back in the labyrinth of investigation, but this time, they had a point of comparison. They began to look for connections between Dr. Alistair Finch and Julian Croft. On the surface, the two men had little in common. One was a man of science, a delver into the human psyche. The other was a man of art, a purveyor of aesthetic judgment. But as Corbin and Reed dug deeper, a faint, almost imperceptible thread began to emerge. Both men had been involved in a highly publicized court case several years prior. Dr. Finch had been a key witness for the prosecution, providing a psychological profile of the defendant, a brilliant but troubled young artist named Sebastian Thorne. Julian Croft had been the art expert who had testified that Thorne's paintings, once celebrated for their raw emotion, had taken a dark and disturbing turn, mirroring the artist's own descent into madness. Thorne had been accused of murdering his mentor, a renowned painter, in a fit of jealous rage. The evidence was largely circumstantial, but the testimony of Finch and Croft had been instrumental in securing a conviction. Thorne was sentenced to life in a maximum security psychiatric facility. Could this be the connection? Was the artisan a copycat, or worse, an accomplice of Thorne's, seeking revenge on those who had put him away? The theory was a promising one, but it was also a complex one. Thorne had been in solitary confinement for the past 5 years, with no contact with the outside world. It seemed impossible that he could be orchestrating these murders from behind bars. Corbin and Reed decided to pay him a visit, a journey into the heart of the beast's den. The asylum was a place of sterile silence and barely suppressed chaos. Sebastian Thorne was a man who seemed both older and younger than his 30 years. His eyes, a startlingly intelligent blue, held a chilling intensity. He was calm, almost serene, as Corbin and Reed questioned him about the murders of Finch and Croft. He denied any involvement, of course, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a spark of amusement, that sent a shiver down Corbin's spine. They were men of judgment, Thorne said, his voice a soft, cultured murmur. They saw the world in black and white, good and evil. But the world, detectives, is a canvas of infinite shades of gray. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curving of his lips. The artisan, as you call them, seems to understand this. They are not a killer. They are a liberator, freeing these men from the prison of their own narrow minds. The interview was a dead end. Thorne was a master of manipulation, a puppeteer of words. He gave them nothing, and yet he gave them everything. His words were a taunt, a confirmation that they were on the right track, but also a warning that the game was far more complex than they could have imagined. As the detectives left the asylum, a new piece of the puzzle fell into place. A cryptic email was sent to a local news station, a message from the artisan themselves. It was a short, poetic verse, a riddle that seemed to mock the police and their efforts. The doctor who played God, the critic who judged the soul, their hubris was their downfall, a story to be told. 2 feathers, black and white. A balance has been struck, but the canvas is not yet finished, the final stroke not plucked. The email was untraceable, of course, a ghost in the machine. But the verse was a revelation. It confirmed that the murders were not random acts of violence. They were targeted assassinations, a form of twisted justice. The artisan was not just a killer. They were a moralist, a self-proclaimed judge, jury, and executioner. Corbin and Reed redoubled their efforts, focusing on the court case of Sebastian Thorne. They re-interviewed everyone involved, from the lawyers to the jury members. They re-examined every piece of evidence, a single word of testimony. And then they found it. A small, seemingly insignificant detail that had been overlooked. A name mentioned in passing during the trial, a former student of Dr. Finch's, a young prodigy who had also been a protege of the murdered artist. A young man who had been a close friend of Sebastian Thorne. His name was Elias Vance. Vance had disappeared shortly after the trial, vanishing without a trace. He was a ghost, a phantom with no past and no present. But as the detectives began to dig into his life, a chilling portrait began to emerge. Vance was a genius with an IQ that was off the charts. He was a polymath with a deep knowledge of art, science, and philosophy. He was also a recluse, a man who had cut himself off from the world. He was the perfect suspect. The hunt for Elias Vance was on. But he was a ghost, a man who knew how to stay hidden. The detectives were in a race against time, not only to find him but to predict his next move. The artisan's verse had hinted at a third act, a final stroke. Who would be the next victim in this gruesome symphony of death? The pressure was immense. The city was on edge, and the media was relentless. Corbin and Reed found themselves under a microscope, their every move scrutinized. But they were driven by a shared sense of purpose, a determination to stop the artisan before he could claim another life. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Reed, with her meticulous attention to detail, had been re-examining the crime scene photos. She noticed something that everyone else had missed. In the background of one of the photos from Julian Croft's gallery, there was a small, almost imperceptible reflection in a glass display case. It was a distorted image, but when enhanced, it revealed a face. A face that matched the old university photos of Elias Vance. They had him, or rather, they had his face. But where was he? The search for Vance intensified, a citywide manhunt for a man who had become the living embodiment of fear. The detectives knew that they were getting close, that the net was tightening. But they also knew that they were dealing with a man who was always one step ahead, a man who had turned murder into a deadly game of chess. The second chapter of Viridia's nightmare was drawing to a close, but the final act was yet to come. The city held its breath, a collective sense of dread hanging over it like a shroud. The symphony of silence was about to reach its crescendo, and the world was about to learn the true and terrible meaning of the artisan's art. The final stroke was about to be plucked, and the canvas of chaos was about to be completed. The discovery of Elias Vance's face in the crime scene photo was the break that detectives Corbin and Reed had been desperately searching for. It transformed the phantom artisan into a tangible, albeit elusive, target. The manhunt for Vance consumed the city of Viridia, his image plastered across every news channel and newspaper. He was now the most wanted man in the country, a ghost who had finally been given a face. But Vance was no ordinary fugitive. He was a master of disguise and deception, a man who could blend into the shadows and disappear at will. The detectives knew that they were not just hunting a man. They were hunting a mind, a brilliant and twisted intellect that was always one step ahead. They had to think like him, to anticipate his moves, to understand the twisted logic that fueled his gruesome art. The key, they believed, lay in the third verse of the artisan's poetic riddle. The first two verses had targeted the doctor who played God and the critic who judged the soul. Who was the third target? Who was the final piece in this macabre puzzle? Corbin and Reed went back to the Sebastian Thorne case, dissecting it with a renewed sense of urgency. They had focused on the key players, the ones who had sealed Thorne's fate, but perhaps they had been looking in the wrong place. Perhaps the third victim was not someone who had wronged Thorne, but someone who had failed him. Their investigation led them to the lead prosecutor in the Thorne case, a man named Marcus Thorne. The name was a chilling coincidence. Marcus Thorne was Sebastian's older brother. He was the man who had put his own flesh and blood behind bars, a man who had chosen justice, or what he believed to be justice, over family. He was the ultimate betrayer. The detectives raced to Marcus Thorne's home, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. They found him in his study, a room filled with law books and accolades. He was alive, but he was not alone. Elias Vance was with him, a calm and collected figure standing in the shadows. He was not a monster in appearance. He was a man of average height and build, with intelligent eyes that held a hint of sadness. He held a syringe in his hand, the same type of weapon that had been used on the other two victims. The standoff was a tense and silent one. Vance showed no signs of fear or aggression. He was a man who had accepted his fate, a man who had a story to tell. And in the final, chilling moments of his reign of terror, he told it. He spoke of his friendship with Sebastian Thorne, a bond forged in a shared love of art and a shared disdain for the hypocrisy of the world. He spoke of Sebastian's descent into madness, a journey fueled by a world that did not understand his genius. He spoke of the murder of Sebastian's mentor, an act of desperation, not malice. And he spoke of the trial, a perversion of justice where the truth was twisted and a good man was condemned. "I am not a murderer," Vance said, his voice a soft, steady whisper. "I am a storyteller. I am the one who gives a voice to the silenced, a face to the forgotten." Dr. Finch, Julian Croft, Marcus Thorne, they were not victims. They were characters in a story of betrayal and injustice. They were the ones who held the brushes that painted Sebastian's fate. "I merely provided the final stroke." As he spoke, a single tear rolled down his cheek. It was a tear not of remorse, but of a profound and unshakable sense of purpose. He had not set out to be a killer. He had set out to be a creator, a twisted artist who used death as his medium. The standoff ended not with a bang, but with a quiet and deliberate act. As Corbin and Reed moved to apprehend him, Vance raised the syringe to his own neck. There was a moment of hesitation, a final, fleeting glance at a world he had tried to reshape in his own dark image. And then he pushed the plunger. Elias Vance, the artisan of death, the murderer with the IQ of a devil, was gone. He had written the final chapter of his own story, a requiem for a devil. The city of Viridia breathed a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. But for Corbin and Reed, the case would forever haunt them. They had caught the killer, but they had also been forced to confront the dark and unsettling questions that his crimes had raised. Where is the line between justice and revenge? What is the true nature of art, and can it ever justify the taking of a human life? The case of the artisan became a legend in Viridia, a cautionary tale whispered in the dark. The gruesome chain of shocking killings had not only shattered the city's sense of security, it had shattered the very foundations of their understanding of good and evil. It had shown them that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who lurk in the shadows, but the ones who hide in plain sight, their brilliance a mask for their madness. The canvas of chaos was finally complete, a masterpiece of horror that would forever be etched in the city's memory. The symphony of silence had reached its final, chilling crescendo. And in the end, all that was left was the echo of a story of a murderer with the IQ of a devil, a story that had shattered all boundaries and left a scar on the soul of a city. The requiem had been sung, and the devil had finally been laid to rest. But the questions, the unsettling and unanswerable questions, would linger long after the final notes had faded into silence. Months bled into one another, and the vibrant hues of autumn in Viridia gave way to the stark, skeletal monochrome of winter. The city, on the surface, had begun to heal. The sensational headlines about the artisan were replaced by more mundane news. The palpable fear on the streets subsided into a quiet, collective memory. The case was officially closed. Elias Vance was dead. Justice had been served. But for Detectives Miles Corbin and Evelyn Reed, the silence that followed the storm was more deafening than the chaos itself. The echoes of the artisan's symphony lingered, playing on a loop in the quiet corridors of their minds. Corbin found himself adrift. The clear-cut lines of his world, once a comfort, had been blurred into an unsettling grayscale. He would sit in his dimly lit office late at night, the case file for Elias Vance spread open before him, not as an investigator but as a reluctant student. He read Vance's manifesto, recovered from a hidden hard drive, a sprawling document that was part philosophical treatise, part artistic creed, and part confession. He saw the world through Vance's eyes, a flawed, hypocritical stage where men of power played God without consequence. Vance's methods were monstrous, but the questions he raised were insidious, burrowing deep into Corbin's soul. He started questioning his own role, no longer a simple soldier of justice, but a janitor cleaning up the messes of a fundamentally broken system. The black and white world he had inhabited for 2 decades was now a canvas of infinite, terrifying shades of gray, just as Sebastian Thorne had described. Reed handled the aftermath differently. Where Corbin retreated inward, she charged forward, burying herself in new cases with a ferocious intensity. She became even more meticulous, her reports more detailed, her focus unwavering. It was her way of imposing order on a world that she now knew was teetering on the brink of chaos. But the change was there, a subtle hardening of her gaze, a new cynicism that tinged her voice. She would find herself in an art gallery, a place she once found solace, and see not beauty, but potential crime scenes. A splash of red paint on a canvas would evoke the bloody walls of Dr. Finch's home. A perfectly sculpted statue would remind her of Julian Croft's contorted body. Vance had not just killed people. He had murdered a piece of her perception, tainting the world of art and beauty with the stain of death. Their partnership, once a seamless dance of intuition and logic, became a quiet alliance of two haunted souls. They spoke less of the case, but it was always present, an invisible third passenger in their patrol car. They both knew they were waiting for something, a final piece of closure that Vance's suicide had denied them. The closure they sought, they realized, was not in the files or the evidence lockers. It was locked away in a sterile room in the city's most secure psychiatric facility. They had to see Sebastian Thorne one last time. The asylum was unchanged, a monument of sterile quiet. Sebastian Thorne sat in the common room, a sketchbook resting in his lap. He looked different. The manic intensity in his eyes had been replaced by a profound, almost beatific calm. He looked up as Corbin and Reed approached, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips, as if he had been expecting them. "The Pilgrim's Return," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "Have you come to admire my latest work?" He gestured to his sketchbook. The pages were filled with intricate, abstract designs, beautiful yet deeply unsettling. They were reminiscent of the sigils Vance had drawn, but more complex, more evolved. And in the corner of each drawing, a single, perfectly rendered feather. "We came to tell you it's over, Sebastian," Reed said, her voice firm, betraying none of her inner turmoil. Thorne chuckled, a soft, airy sound. "Over? My dear detective, a story like this is never over. It merely enters a new chapter." He looked from Reed to Corbin, his gaze lingering on the weary detective. Elias was a brilliant student. He understood that to create something truly transcendent, you must first deconstruct. You must shatter the boundaries. "He was a murderer, Thorne," Corbin stated, his voice a low growl. "He butchered 3 people to make a point." "Did he?" Thorne tilted his head, a gesture of mock curiosity. "Or did he simply hold up a mirror?" He didn't introduce evil into their lives. He merely exposed what was already there. The doctor's God complex, the critic's venomous pride, my brother's ambitious betrayal. He spoke the last words with a chilling detachment. Elias wasn't the artist. He was the brush, the curator. He prepared the gallery for the true masterpiece. A cold dread washed over Corbin. He had seen himself as the one solving the puzzle, but what if he was just another piece on the board? "And what is the masterpiece?" Sebastian Thorne's smile widened. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that seemed to suck all the air from the room. "The idea, the echo, the knowledge that the world is not what it seems, that the line between sanity and madness, between art and murder, is so very, very thin. Elias is gone, but his work is now immortal. People are talking about him, debating his philosophy. He has followers, disciples who see him as a visionary. He didn't just kill 3 men, detectives. He gave birth to a legend, and a legend can never die." He leaned back, picking up his pencil. He wrote a beautiful, brutal preface. But the story itself, the story is only just beginning. As Corbin and Reed walked out of the asylum, the winter wind felt colder than ever. They had closed the case file on Elias Vance, but Sebastian Thorne had just opened a new one without physical evidence or clear culprits. It was a case of ideology, a battle for the soul of the city. The artisan was dead, but his ghost now haunted Viridia, not as a killer, but as a question. A question that whispered in the alleyways where new sigils appeared, in the online forums where his manifesto was treated as gospel, and in the nightmares of the 2 detectives who had looked into the abyss and found it staring back. The requiem for the devil had ended, but the echoes of his chilling symphony would resonate forever. The city was safe from the man, but it was now and forever at the mercy of his idea. And as Corbin looked out over the sprawling city lights, he understood the horrifying truth. Some monsters can't be killed, because they don't live in the flesh, but in the stories we tell when the lights go out.